So, from that you would gather that I grew up in South Africa. And I had two related bits of fortune. The coincidence of the color of my skin, which meant that I was privileged in all sorts of ways. I did very little work at school because I got involved in politics in my teens, and did terribly in my final school exam, but still automatically went to university, paid for by the state, simply because I was white. I played all the sport I wanted to play. I had a very limited education at school, but a wonderful education over many, many years at university, because the only way to stay out of the apartheid military was to study endlessly, which is what I did. But the other thing that I'm grateful for is that my mother was not South African, she was Austrian. And she was actually one of very few Jews to survive the Second World War in Vienna itself. She was hidden in a coal cellar for 3.5 years. And every time there was a Gestapo or SS raid nearby, she was rolled up into a carpet, and the carpet was put up against the wall. And that's how she survived. And when my kids were old enough, I took them to Vienna to see the cellar. And the steel door leading down to the coal cellar still has not bullet holes, but bullets in it. It was so thick that when the military tried to shoot the lock away to see if there was anyone inside, bullets didn't even penetrate the door, and they were still there. And that's how she survived. And my parents could never really settle in apartheid South Africa. So we did what my sister and I came to call semigrate on a regular basis. One Thursday, my father came home and said, we're moving to Austria on Monday. We just had enough. We'd pack everything up and we'd go to Austria. We'd live in Vienna. On occasion, we lived in Salzburg. We also lived in The Hague for a bit and in London for a bit. And why I say, I mean, I don't think I really appreciated the travel at that age. But the impact I think it had on me was to see that there was an alternative to the madness of an apartheid state. Because South Africa was, and even still remains, a very insular country in many ways. And many South Africans growing up actually accepted our system as normal. And what was our system? Well, we had a little bit of democracy for whites who didn't want to question anything, who didn't mind not having a free press, not having free politics, because our newspapers didn't contain news. They contain sports reports, because South Africa has a hierarchy: rugby, religion, cricket, and then what would be called the folk, the people. We got television in 1976 for the first time when I was 12. We used to have half an hour a night of an American Western called Shame. They were too scared to show news on television until 1978. And then we got half an hour of news. Well, they called it news. It was the gospel according to the apartheid state. So there was this little bit of democracy, but the reality is that it was a racist apartheid state, by law. We had something called the group areas. Well, first of all, we had legislation that classified everybody according to race. So I was white. The majority of people, 83%, were black African. There were also some people who were called in the apartheid legislation colored, people of mixed race. There was a community called the Asian community who had their roots in South and Southeast Asia. And these different racial groups were treated differently depending on how dark they were. And the city in which I grew up, Cape Town, was actually arranged on concentric circles. And the darker the color of your skin, the further out you lived from the city center. And eventually, when I was in my late teens, the first political campaign I was involved with was about an attempt by the apartheid state to move all black South Africans even further out of Cape Town into one township that had only one road going in and one road going out. And they were concrete reinforced roads so that tanks could get in and out. Because the society was, unsurprisingly, completely militarized. We spent 14% of our GDP on defense. 14%. Today, the United Kingdom spends just over 2%. And I would argue that's far too much. So every race group had its own group area that it was allowed to live in. There were curfews. So if you were not white, you were not allowed to be in a group area after sunset. And if you were found in a white group area, you could be thrown in jail for 90 days without charge. But then they could renew those 90 days for as long as they wanted. So you could be in jail for years and years, simply for being in a white group area after sunset. There was job reservation. So you were only allowed to apply for certain jobs depending on the color of your skin. So in Cape Town, where the majority of the population were people of mixed race, jobs as waiters and waitresses were reserved for the so-called colored population. The most menial and manual jobs were reserved for black Africans, and white South Africans could do anything. In fact, for those who looked and sounded like me, who weren't the smartest, there were always jobs available. So there were no unemployed white South Africans. So if you were white and living in South Africa, you had a pretty damn good life, unless you wanted to question the system you were living in. Obviously, all amenities were divided racially. So Cape Town in particular is famous for its beaches, but the best beaches were reserved only for whites. And there were then 2 other beaches that were for non-whites, but they too were divided between people of mixed race and black Africans. Over time, black Africans lost their South African citizenship and were given citizenship of 13 what were called Bantustans, or homelands. These were tiny areas, usually on what was effectively wasteland, that had no economies whatsoever, and that were run by these completely corrupt black puppet rulers who were in cahoots with the apartheid state. And the only real economic activity in these homelands was gambling, which was illegal in South Africa, which was a strongly Christian country, but legal in these so-called homelands. So white South Africans would flock to the homelands. Some of you might remember a place called Sun City that became quite notorious as a sort of a gambling center. And a whole series of musicians went and played Sun City in violation of the international cultural boycott, including people like Frank Sinatra. I'm trying to think who else performed there. Weirdly, Joan Armatrading. And then a guy called Steve van Zandt wrote a song that I actually really liked called We Won't Play Sun City. It was a great song. Van Zandt today, sadly, is an apologist for Israel, something that I don't quite understand. And he resists very vocally any sort of comparison between South Africa and Israel. But the nature of the state went far deeper than these easily observable things. So, for instance, it was illegal to have relationships across the color line. So there were a number of pieces of legislation, including the so-called Immorality Act, that made it illegal for a black and a white person to have sex. But it went even further than that. And to give you a sense of the absurdity of this country and its laws, my wife is Bangladeshi. She would not come to South Africa. We met at university here. She would not come to South Africa until the worst of the apartheid laws had been removed from the statute books in the early 1990s. But if she had, not only would she have to live in a different group area to me, and we would not be allowed to live together, not only wouldn't we be allowed to have a physical relationship by law, and obviously we wouldn't be allowed to marry in South Africa, but we were not even allowed to travel alone together in the same car, because that would create the temptation of something else happening between us. So that was the sort of pettiness at which the legislation devolved ultimately. Now, it won't come as a shock to you to discover that the apartheid state was systemically and deeply corrupt. 50% of the budget of the state was never presented to Parliament. This was for activities that were off the book. And when I first got into Parliament in 1994, I became the ranking ANC member on something called the Public Accounts Committee, the main financial oversight committee. And I started looking into some of the state spending during the apartheid years. And what I discovered was that not even from the secret budget, because we have no idea what happened to that budget. It was used to buy newspapers in the United States, the United Kingdom, Europe, to paint a good picture of South Africa, to try and win friends for a party. It was used for covert military operations abroad, for the assassination of ANC leaders around the world, and various other things that the state, obviously to buy oil and weapons as well. So I shudder to think the quantum of corruption in that secret budget. But even in the budget that Parliament had a tiny bit of oversight over, I found billions and billions of rands that had just been taken. And in fact, when I first went back to South Africa, because I had to leave the country in the mid-80s, after I joined the ANC underground when it was still a banned, illegal organization. But when I went back in 1991, I worked as a facilitator in the constitutional negotiations process. And the working group that I was running had this very senior apartheid-era politician. He was the main negotiator for the government, and then there was a main ANC negotiator, and I was supposed to be the neutral facilitator, having been involved with the ANC for decades already. One Friday evening, after negotiations, we would have drinks as always. I then read in the Sunday papers that this guy, who'd been in perfect health on Friday night, drinking as much as usual, had retired for reasons of ill health. Interestingly, he retired to Switzerland. And a few years later, when I landed up in Parliament and I started going through the state accounts, I discovered that from his last 3 departments of which he'd been minister, 11 billion rand had disappeared. If I had any money and I was a betting person, I would have put money on it that most of that money went with him into exile in Swiss bank accounts. Now, obviously, the justice system was deeply corrupted as well, and there was a totally different system of justice for white and black South Africans. So if a white and a black South African was arrested for the same offense, you could actually be tried for 2 very different offenses. The black South African most of the time would be tried for a terrorist offense, while the white South African would be tried for a criminal offense. Of course, there were some exceptions to that. There were some white South Africans, interestingly, many of them Jewish, some of them Afrikaans, who were tried for treason and were in the same trials as Nelson Mandela during his treason trials. The interesting thing is not only were some of the defendants Jewish, but the man who prosecuted Mandela, who called for the death penalty for Mandela, was also a Jewish South African. The ANC was banned. It was illegal to have any words of any ANC leader or the organization in your possession, and you could go to jail for years and years just for that. It was illegal to have a likeness, let alone a photograph, of any ANC leader. So if somebody had had a picture of Nelson Mandela, they could be arrested and put away for many years just for that. And of course, the ANC were called terrorists. When I was at school, at 15 years of age, I had to sign up for my compulsory military service. And a gentleman from the military came to sign us up. And at that point, South Africa was involved in a border war with Angola to our north. And this guy said to us, so, they claim that there's a communist, because terrorist and communist were effectively interchangeable words. The fact that the ANC was a broad church that included, for instance, on economics, everything from right-wing Thatcherites to radical communists seemed to be almost incidental to them. So this guy said to us, so it's claimed that there's a communist behind every bush on the border. That's not true. There are not enough bushes. So, you grew up in this completely paranoid society where you had the sense that this ANC was these communist terrorist ogres. Except that I was very fortunate in that I had parents who were in the South African context fairly enlightened and liberal. And my mother worked for an organization called the Black Sash, which was a group of women, predominantly white, who protested against the worst excesses of the apartheid system and sometimes went into black townships, which was illegal. And she would take me with her. And I would see from a very young age that all of the graffiti was about the ANC and about Mandela and Tambo and Sisulu and Slovo. And I got very confused because here was this white, Jewish-looking guy alongside all these communist terrorists. And then when we were in Austria, which happened 6 times before I was 12, I could read stuff about the ANC. When we came to the UK, there used to be quite a lot in the media about it. So I was fortunate to learn more than the average South African would. So I got involved in the ANC in my late teens. I joined an underground structure in a squatter settlement 10 kilometers from Cape Town, and that's where I was recruited into the ANC, hearing something called the Crossroads Crisis. And the basis of the resistance against the apartheid state was, yes, the ANC formed an armed struggle. It wasn't very effective, but it was symbolically very important. And it hit its strategic military targets. And it was created at a time when the black population was basically being massacred on a very regular basis by the apartheid military. And some of you who have long memories might remember the name Sharp, where 70 women were simply murdered in cold blood for protesting about having to carry a race-based ID card. Or Soweto in 1976, where hundreds of school children were mowed down in cold blood because they were protesting against having to be educated in the language of the oppressor, Afrikaans. Or even Boycotton in the early 90s, when what was called the Third Force, an underground military of the apartheid state, attacked single-sex hostels in industrial areas where migrant workers who supported the ANC were being harmed, killing in one incident 58 people. But the main focus of the resistance and the main things that brought about an end to apartheid in South Africa far sooner than ourselves in the liberation movement ever expected was crucially boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Because by refusing to buy South African products around the world, it put enormous pressure on the South African economy. By students, particularly in the United States and in this country, refusing to take out loans with Barclays Bank in the UK and with what was then Chase Manhattan in the United States, they forced those banks to stop rolling over the apartheid state's debt and to leave South Africa, because they realized they were going to lose out on an entire generation of customers to their rivals. The sports boycott, even more than the cultural boycott, had a profound impact on South Africans, especially white South Africans, absolutely sports mad. The only good thing about the sports boycott is that our rugby and cricket team could describe themselves as undefeated world champions for many years because we played no one. But these were incredibly important, and BDS would have been irrelevant without the massive global support that the anti-apartheid movement engendered. And then the role of millions of ordinary South Africans making the townships of the country ungovernable. So that by the early 1990s, it was incredibly difficult for the police, the security services, and the military to even enter some of these townships. There were street committees on every single street in every single township that organized those communities. And that ungovernability started costing the state a lot of money as well. And the consequence of that was that the quality of life of white South Africans started to deteriorate. And that is why F.W. de Klerk, who was no liberal, he was actually on the right wing of the National Party, the party of apartheid, realized that he had to bring change, that it was unsustainable for his party to stay in power with the status quo. He honestly believed he could rule in collaboration with moderate blacks. He thought the ANC didn't have nearly as much support as it claimed. Now, it wasn't only South Africans who described Mandela and the ANC as terrorists. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan did likewise. And in fact, Margaret Thatcher suggested covertly to the South African state that they execute Mandela, that he was too dangerous to keep alive in prison. Brilliant book by a friend of mine called Henny van Vuren called Apartheid, Guns and Money traces the amount of covert support given by the British state, the American state, and many European countries to the apartheid South African state. And it's really worth reading. But the only countries that were prepared to recognize apartheid South Africa proudly were Taiwan and Israel. And there is a particular irony in the case of Israel, because the people who ruled South Africa after the Second World War, that turned apartheid into the legislated system it was, were all Nazi sympathizers, many of whom had been jailed during the Second World War because of their Nazi sympathies and because they started Nazi-supporting militias in South Africa. Most famously something called the Assaf Harel. And in fact, in the 1970s, when South Africa's then Prime Minister, B.J. Vorster, went to Israel to conclude a deal that would make both Israel and apartheid South Africa nuclear states, the first place he went on his arrival was Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial. B.J. Vorster had been in jail during the Second World War because of his Nazi sympathies. He was an unrepentant neo-Nazi. And the early apartheid legislation in South Africa, from 1948 to 1955 in particular, mirrored the Nazi legislation from 1933 to 1938. Now, the Rome Statute, enshrined in international law, describes apartheid as systemic, inhuman acts of oppression and domination by one group over another. And that's what we experienced in South Africa. In Israel, if you're a Jewish Israeli, you live in a partial democracy, just like I did in South Africa. You can vote, although the choices are almost as awful as the choices here. You can read newspapers, and only some of them are censored, not all of them. You can watch news, state TV channels, independent channels, but there are unwritten laws about what news is allowed and what is not allowed. But your democracy is profoundly better than the democracy available to Palestinian citizens of Israel. You are treated by the nation-state law as superior under the law because of the fact that you are Jewish. Israel doesn't have Bantustan. Instead, what it has is an illegal and brutal occupation of the Palestinian territories that it has fragmented more and more every year, so that when you look at maps of Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories today, they will remarkably remind you of the maps of South Africa that the South African state used to issue. Everyone else ignored them, but the South African state used to issue these maps with these independent, fragmented 13 homelands all over the place. Just the visual similarity has always struck me as extraordinary. The system of apartheid in South Africa relied on three things: dehumanization of the other. We had an entire state religion that justified the system of apartheid and the differences, intellectual, physical, etc., between different race groups. As the founder of apartheid, who shockingly I discovered spent 2 years at the same high school that I did, a few years ago, the school invited me back to give a talk at their 175th anniversary. So I turn up at the school. And this very excited woman says to me, "You have to come and see our new school museum." So I went off to see the school museum, and there was a big section entitled Politics. But there were only 2 displays under politics. One was about me and my remarkably unsuccessful political career, although the school somehow didn't see it in those terms. The other one was about Hendrik Verwoerd, the architect of the system of apartheid. I asked whether it might be possible to remove one or other of us, because I felt a bit uncomfortable by it. Verwoerd had a PhD in psychology from Oxford University, where you'll be shocked to discover that his thesis was basically a rationalization of a system of racial discrimination that he called apartheid. You can go on to so many different YouTube channels today. You can even look at some Israeli news, and you hear things that Israeli Jews say about Palestinians. And I find myself thinking, this all sounds familiar to me. I'm experiencing a sense of profound déjà vu. These people are less than human. They are stupid. They're only capable of that or that job. If it wasn't for us, they wouldn't be alive anymore. So the dehumanization is essential to any system of oppression. The second is obviously to enforce that your society has to be entirely militarized. Now, I said to you that apartheid South Africa spent 14% of its GDP on the military. We don't know what that figure is for Israel, because Israel does not declare such a figure. Its state finances are as opaque as apartheid South Africa's were. We don't even know how much of the budget is not made available to Parliament. Not even parliamentarians know that. At least in South Africa we knew it was 50%. We don't know what that figure is in Israel. I estimate, based on my own investigative research in Israel, that probably 17 to 18% of Israel's GDP is spent on the military and defense. But that's a guesstimate. And the state is profoundly and systemically corrupt, not just morally, but materially. One of the reasons why Benjamin Netanyahu is so determined to subjugate the judiciary to the will of Parliament is because the man has so many outstanding corruption cases against him. Ariel Sharon, kept in a coma for I don't know how many years now, has dozens and dozens of corruption cases against him. Ehud Barak, a former Israeli prime minister, actually went to jail briefly for corruption. And most of that corruption happens in the defense trade. The arms trade globally accounts for about 40% of all corruption in global trade. And Israel is at the center of that trade, acting as something of a research and development center, a laboratory for American, British, and European weapons, using the occupied territory effectively as a laboratory for the testing of weaponry, including illegal weaponry, white phosphorus, cluster munitions, etc., etc. Now, when one thinks about the expropriation of land in apartheid South Africa, we had something called the Land Act in 1913, which basically made it illegal for someone of color to actually own land in South Africa, except in the so-called homelands that developed later. Israel has had a series of laws, starting with the 1950 absentee property law that deprives Palestinians of their own land and makes it impossible for any Palestinian who is no longer resident on their land to own that land. And if that land is required for the creation of a new Israeli settlement, Palestinians simply lose their land without compensation. To enforce the Group Areas Act, South African apartheid from 1955 through 1983 had to undertake a series of forced evictions. We used to have mixed race communities, a very famous place called District 6 in Cape Town, where the most extraordinary jazz musician, known first as Dollar Brand and then Abdullah Ibrahim, used to live. Used to have Jewish inhabitants, Muslim inhabitants, black South Africans, white South Africans of mixed race. Overnight, trucks moved in, simply took people, threw them on the back of the trucks, drove them to a deserted area known as the Cape Flats and dropped them there. The moment of ultimate tragedy for the Palestinian people, 1948, when Israel became a nation state, saw over 750,000 Palestinians forcibly evicted from their homes. And that has continued at a much slower rate ever since, but is central to the state of Israel. Everybody in Israel has an identity card, just as we did in South Africa. And the most important thing on that identity card that determines which identity card you have is whether you're Jewish, Arab Israeli, Christian Israeli, or Palestinian. And just like in South Africa, that determines everything about your life. The nation-state law is the closest law that I have come to that replicates South Africa's Population Registration Act. In addition, if you are a Jewish citizen of Israel and you marry someone who is not Israeli, there is a legal process by which they can become an Israeli citizen and live with you in Israel in the meantime. Even if you're a Palestinian Israeli, let alone from the occupied territories, there is no such legal system for your partner to legally reside with you. Just as we've had Sharpeville, Soweto, Boipatong, we think of Shatila, the Great March of Return. Just last year, 10 incursions into the occupied territories, 67 children dead. This year, we've got to the 10th of March. As of Thursday night, 74 Palestinians had been murdered by Israeli soldiers or Israeli settlers.
13 children.
13 children, 2 of them shot in the back. And this is what Israel describes as the most moral military on the planet. There is a fundamental, there are obviously a number of differences. These are 2 different countries in different situations. So there are an enormous amount of similarities, but also some important differences. 2 of the differences. When I first went to the occupied territories, the thing that struck me immediately was the system of checkpoints, where Palestinians, to get in and out, many of them for school, for university, for work, have to go through this degrading, dehumanizing process. It reminded me of my grandmother on my father's side, who was deeply, deeply racist, who had a man who, when I met him, was 73 years old working for her. He worked in the garden, and then he had to drive her around in her very fancy car. 73 years old, and she referred to him as boy. And he had to wear shorts. Because to her, he was just a child. And at the checkpoints, you see 18-year-old Israeli soldiers, men and women, treating young Palestinians, elderly Palestinians, worse than they treat their household pets. You can't go to university today. Why not? I don't know. I don't feel like letting you go to university today. But I have exams to write. I won't be able to get my degree. I don't care. And then if you continue to argue the point, you get rewarded with a rifle back in the face. And the sort of language that is used. Because after all, these people aren't human. They're not Jewish, they're not like me. In the homelands in South Africa, you could just walk, drive, cycle in and out. You didn't have to go through this appalling process. Everyone in South Africa had to use the same roads. I'm not sure if you're aware, but in Israel and Palestine, Palestinians actually have to use separate roads completely. Their cars have separate number plates of a different color, so that they can be easily identified. So the chances of mistakenly shooting or firing on a non-Palestinian car are obviously reduced. The fact that in South Africa all white males had to go to the military for 2 years was a way in which the state managed to pollute the minds of all young men. Because if you didn't go in as a racist, chances are you'd come out as a racist. And very sadly, I saw that with friends of mine. I was too cowardly to go to the military. I avoided it, and then when they wouldn't allow me to study anymore, I fled the country. In Israel, all men and women go to the military. So there is an opportunity to have a much greater impact on the mindset of the society as a whole. And that is absolutely crucial to the process of dehumanization. But there is another fundamental difference. For those of you who are old enough, and I know there's only a few of you, but you might remember that after Sharpeville, after Soweto, there was outrage around the world. Oh, the picture of Hector Peterson, a 13-year-old boy, being carried by his friend, shot dead, with his younger sister running next to them in floods of tears, is an iconic picture of the brutality of the South African apartheid state against its country's children, from Soweto 76. 74 people killed since the 1st of January this year, and the vast majority of Western governments and politicians have said a total of nothing. Of nothing. That is a fundamental difference. While people of conscience around the world were in most countries free, and in some countries actively encouraged to involve themselves in the global anti-apartheid movement, we in the West are being actively discouraged from supporting Palestine. Palestinian voices are being silenced in our countries. And one of the most pernicious ways in which this is being done is through the abuse and weaponization of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And it's not just pernicious because of its consequences, but it's pernicious in conception as well. So why do I state that? My mother survived the war with her mother. She lost dozens of her family, some of whom were murdered in Theresienstadt, most of whom were murdered in Auschwitz. When I was elected to the South African Parliament, unsurprisingly, I discovered the Holocaust had never been mentioned in the history of the South African Parliament in a formal debate in Parliament. Never. Unsurprising, because the people who took over the country after the Second World War were neo-Nazis. And their racist vision was a neo-Nazi vision. So I introduced the first ever motion in the history of South Africa's parliamentary democracy, both before and after 1994, on the Holocaust and what it means for racism around the world. And I spoke not just of the European Holocaust. I spoke not just of the racism in South Africa or the racism in Zimbabwe after Robert Mugabe completely lost his mind. And I spoke of the racism in Israel and the sad irony of that being the case. I have lectured at Auschwitz on genocide prevention, invited by the Auschwitz Institute, for whom I contributed a chapter to a volume on genocide prevention that they produced and launched in Auschwitz. "15 months ago, I received a notice of investigation from the Labour Party to say that my social media activity undermined the party's ability to campaign against racism and anti-Semitism. I was a little perplexed. So I wrote back to the party at great length. And I asked, because what they were telling me to do was to stop criticizing Israel. And I asked whether, in effect, they were asking me to choose between the anti-racism I learned from my former boss, Nelson Mandela, and my friend and political mentor, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, or the hierarchy of racism adopted by my own constituency MP, Keir Starmer. I still haven't received a response. Now, the irony of this has nothing to do with me, because I'm quite happy to stand up and defend my personal record as a lifelong anti-racist. Probably before Keir Starmer knew there were people of colour in the world. But when Palestinians or supporters of the Palestinian struggle are silenced by being called anti-Semites, we are effectively stopping any criticism of Israel. We are stopping freedom of speech, freedom of political activity, and we are effectively complicit in the war crimes that are being committed by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territories every single day. But the real irony is not even that Keir Starmer, who claims to once have been a human rights lawyer, is expelling anti-racist Jews from the Labour Party in order to combat anti-Semitism. Let's just think about that. Imagine a political party in the West, say in Britain, expelling black South Africans who had moved to the UK and joined their party as a means to support the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. That's effectively what's happening. You are 6.5 times more likely to be expelled from Keir Starmer's Labour Party for anti-Semitism if you're Jewish than if you're not. Now that is an achievement. But even worse than that, what is going on in the world at the moment is that racists, and I'll repeat that word, racists, are calling anti-racists racist, while they continue their racism. Now, I spent 6 years studying clinical psychology before I did all the economics and finance. This was all to stay out of the army. I know how I define that psychologically. Normal, it ain't. But it is so pernicious. Has Keir Starmer and his troop, who enforce his version of a hierarchy of racism, because Trevor Phillips, who went on Islamophobic rants indefinitely, was briefly suspended from the Labour Party and put under investigation. He didn't have to wait 15 months. A few months later, he got a letter restoring his membership of the party, without having to withdraw any of his Islamophobic statements, without having to apologize to anyone, just because he's on the right wing of the party, where Starmer happens to sit. Has Keir Starmer, or any of his hierarchy of racism police, ever criticized Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister and now President of Hungary, who uses anti-Semitic imagery in every single election campaign to get elected? Of course he hasn't. Why? Because Orban is big mates with Israel. So like B.J. Foster, you can be a racist, you can be an anti-Semite, but if you buy into the ethno-nationalism that Israel has become the poster child for, you can be as racist as you want. Has Keir Starmer and his hierarchy of racism troops ever called out the anti-Semitism of Donald Trump, or the madness of his followers who wear t-shirts saying 6 million was not enough? Or slightly more simply, for the simple-minded of them, Camp Auschwitz. And I don't know if you noticed, but when these delightful human beings occupied the Capitol on the 6th of January of 2021, there were people in these t-shirts standing next to people holding up Israeli flags. The cognitive dissonance in politics today is completely terrifying. But what it does at the end of the day is it gives Israel a free pass to kill as many Palestinians, adults, children, women, as it wants. And people have got too scared to even say that might not be such a good idea, because then they're going to get called anti-Semites and racists. So what do? We can throw up our hands and say, the world has gone mad. And it's gone mad because this madness supports a particular degree of profound reaction in political thought. Because it's not just Israel you can't question. You can't question the absurd levels of inequalities in our society, where when our frontline health workers at the beginning of the COVID pandemic didn't even have masks and gloves, but we announced a £17 billion increase in defence spending, which Starmer says was insufficient. Where we increased defence spending to the most extreme levels we have seen since the end of the Second World War. Last year, the world spent over $2 trillion on defence. While our militaries, which are the biggest institutional polluters on the planet, don't even have to report their carbon emissions in terms of the Paris Climate Accord. So yeah, we can think about how completely insane the world has got at the moment, and about how we know that every time a politician opens their mouths, they lie. Or we can say, what can we do about it? And you know, I've often been called very naive and idealistic in my work on the arms trade, in my work on anti-racism. And I understand that criticism of being naive and idealistic to mean that I think that maybe the world could be run in a slightly better way. The way things are going at the moment, where the 6th or 7th richest country on the world is using more food banks than at any time since the Second World War. When people who are working 3 jobs still can't afford to feed their families, let alone pay for heating. And I think to myself, well, you know, I left the country in 1986. And the night before I left, very suddenly, I thought, I'll never be able to return to this country in my lifetime. Wow. 5 years later, I was back. facilitating negotiations between the apartheid state and the liberation movement. 4 years after that, Nelson Mandela, the communist ogre, was president of the country. And South Africa has had its challenges. Nothing as bad as before 1994, but it hasn't been easy. But it is so much better a place than it ever could have been before 1994. And it has made me believe that ordinary people can change things, quite profound and fundamental things. So I think to myself, well, I get called an anti-Semite. I'm going to speak out louder for Palestine. I'm going to speak out louder against the racists in our midst, who think that one form of racism is fine, but another not so good. As though there is actually a hierarchy, that being racially abused is some sort of a competition. Not only am I going to speak out louder there, I'm going to work as hard as I did in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, and regardless of how many laws they pass making it illegal, to promote boycott, divestment and sanctions against Israel. Because that is the only thing that is going to bring any sense to the extreme fascist government that runs Israel today. Is when we stop buying Israeli product, when we stop our local authorities investing in anything that has anything to do with Israel, when we stop cultural and sporting association with Israel, and when we force financial companies to divest from supporting the Israeli state and the Israeli military. And the other thing that I'm going to do in the meantime is when I discover that Elbit Systems, the pioneer of drone technology, that continues to murder people, many of them innocent, in the occupied territories, in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Yemen. When I discover that they have 10 factories in the United Kingdom, I'm going to turn up at those factories with my colleagues and comrades from Palestine Action. And I'm actually going to destroy those factories and destroy the machinery. So that now the 10 factories has become 8 because they've been forced to close 2 of them. And they've just lost a contract with the British Armed Forces worth just under £300 million because they didn't deliver on time. Because Palestine Action actually destroyed some of the equipment they were supposed to be delivering to the British Armed Forces. And I'm going to continue doing that until Elbit Systems no longer exists on British soil. Because that is the only way that we are going to bring change. Because if we write nice petitions to our politicians, if we protest outside Westminster or at Trafalgar Square until they don't allow us to protest anymore and the right to protest is getting more and more restricted, they won't even bother to laugh at us. No entity in power willingly gives up that power. The South African state under apartheid did not give up power. It had no choice but to relinquish power. It was forced out of power. And as a Jew, as the son of a Holocaust survivor, as somebody who had the enormous privilege of working under Nelson Mandela, of knowing Archbishop Desmond Tutu, of being able to serve very briefly my ordinary constituents in South Africa, and actually seeing a society change, I'm not going to listen to a bunch of mediocre, mendacious politicians who are maintaining the most reactionary, unequal, and unacceptable status quo that I've seen anywhere in the world since the collapse of South African apartheid. And I hope that you will join me. Thanks.